whatever you got to do, and then go on to your workshop at 10 o'clock. You'll notice that the workshops are in various rooms that have been assigned for them, and you'll see the room next to the title of the workshop. N150 is downstairs directly under this room, and S120 is downstairs also toward the front. 335, if it's 3, it's up on the 3rd floor. If it's 2, it's on this floor. So just to give you an orientation, to where the rooms are that you would find your workshops in. So if you have any questions about that, again, please feel free to see someone at the registration table, and they'll be delighted to help you, or see me, and I'll direct you to where you need to go. So without further ado, I'd like to pray and ask God's blessing upon us, and then we're going to hear from Shanti. Father in heaven, we know that you're all about relationship, starting with the Trinity and moving into creation of mankind. And Father, I just thank you that we humans have the opportunity of learning from you how to love. And so, Lord, we just open ourselves to you, first of all, to give you praise and to give you thanksgiving on this beautiful, beautiful Friday morning. And we ask, God, that in all that we do today and all that we hear today, that you might be given the praise, the honor, the glory, and the thanksgiving. And so, Lord, we pray that you would bless us to hear what you have for us and to see what you would like us to see. And bless and strengthen Shanti to clearly articulate your words today. We thank you, Lord, for these things. Bless those who are still on their way, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
So hopefully I won't be coughing too much at you today. Today is actually, as I shared last night, today's subject is entitled Understanding the Other Half, and it's essentially just all the stuff that we don't tend to get about the opposite sex. And so one of the things that we found in the research is that it is so essential to understand those little things that will make a big difference. As we were talking about last night, there are many of those that can give great hope to marriage. And I must tell you that I have the best opening line in the world because of what I do with this research into men and women, and because probably the book that I'm most well known for is For Women Only, about understanding men. And it's given me the best opening line when I meet people at parties, or that stranger sitting next to you on the airplane. You know how you have that kind of awkward, what do you do? What do you do kind of conversation, right? And usually it's a guy sitting next to me on the airplane, and he says, so what do you do? And I say, I help women understand men. And it's really hilarious because the reaction that I get is half the time it's, what are you going to tell them about us? It's this deer in the headlights, this worry. But sometimes I get this laugh where the guy says, we're really not that complicated. And okay, so I have a question for the women in the room, all right? How many of you have heard a guy say that? We're really simple, we're really not that complicated. Am I the only one? How many of you have said that? That we're really fairly simple, yeah. Okay, so it turns out it's not true. It turns out there is so much depth and complexity that is going on underneath the surface for us as women to realize about the men in our lives. And this doesn't just apply to romantic relationships. Women in the room, how many of you have a son? Yeah, applies so many different cases. But there's so much depth there that we don't understand. We don't recognize what's going on underneath the surface. Sometimes it's stuff that a man might ask have trouble articulating, sometimes even to himself. And all of that is affecting him and affecting us in our relationships every day. And it makes a huge difference once we know this. So we as women have basically some assumptions about men and things that we kind of developed as an idea based on, maybe the middle school playground, about how boys are wired, that we have to unwind. And I'm talking about what women have to think through in a minute. I'm going to talk about the men's side. But one of the big assumptions that we as women have going into relationships that we have to unwind and learn perhaps is not just that there's so much depth in there and there's so many things that I didn't realize, that I didn't know that I didn't know. One of the other big assumptions for us as women, and I'm going to say this out loud, something that I think we as women feel subconsciously, we wouldn't necessarily say out loud, but I'm going to say it, which is the assumption that we women, that we're the ones that are good at relationships. Like that we kind of think we're the ones with the interpersonal skills, right? And so, ladies, you know what that means. That means that if there's a problem, it's his fault. That's what that translates to. And here's what we as women think. We kind of think, and I hate to say this out loud, this is subconscious, but we women kind of think, he just has to learn to relate better. And what I realized as I started diving into this research about how men are wired is the realization that the way that God has wired men to relate is totally legitimate. It's just often totally different. And we don't recognize that stuff. And it is amazing what happens once we see this incredible richness and vulnerability under the surface and realize that so much that we were operating in a way that was perhaps hurting the man in our life, wasn't working with the way he was wired. Suddenly we see this stuff, we know this. It can be a fairly small change, but it definitely has a big impact. Now, guys, you have your own assumptions that have to be confronted as well. And this assumption was evidenced by the fact that after For Women Only came out, the publisher asked me and Jeff if we'd be willing to do the research on For Men Only. You have a big best-selling book. What does the publisher want to do? Right? Write the next book. And so the publisher said, we need to, Jeff, could you and Shanti study women and write the book for men, about women? And Jeff was really kind of hesitant. And it needed to be really in his voice, talking to the men, the same way that For Women Only was me talking to the women. And finally, I said, Jeff, why don't we just go out to dinner and talk about what's some of this hesitation that I'm feeling in you doing this study? And he said, and so we sat down and he said, well, see, here's the problem. For Women Only was about explaining men and helping, women understand men. Yeah? So For Men Only is going to have to be helping men understand women. Yeah, but you guys can't be understood. Yeah, he got himself into trouble. And I'm like, what do you mean we can't be understood? He's like, well, every guy knows that women are just random. He's like digging a hole even more. And I'm like, what do you mean random? And he said, well, look, it's like every guy knows. It's kind of like you're standing in front of a machine this day and you pull this lever and you get this reaction. And then the next day you're standing in front of that same machine and you pull the same lever and you get a totally different reaction. The machine does this. He's like, that's what it's like with you as women. He's like, every man knows that women are just random. And I'm like, we are not random. I got my head wag on. I'm like, we are not random. If you're getting a different reaction, you're pulling a different lever, or you're pulling it differently, or something. because we are not. We can be systematized and understood just like you as men can. So this was essentially a giant research project to prove to Jeff that women can be understood. And actually, and he was convinced. And here's the assumption that we realize is underneath, the dangerous assumption that's underneath in the heart of many men. Just like this idea that we as women have, that we're kind of the ones with the interpersonal skills, so he has to learn to relate better, when actually the way he's wired to relate is totally legit. The assumption that men tend to have that's dangerous is this idea that there's some part of my wife that I'm never really going to be able to understand because there is this randomness in her. And what it lends itself to is giving up pretty easily when they're confused about, and I'm not talking about giving up on the marriage, I'm talking about giving up understanding what's going on in that moment. And what happens is that when you see your wife be unhappy about something or frustrated and you're confused as a guy, if you operate under the predisposition that, well, there's some part of her that's just random, and so that may not make sense, so I'll just kind of walk away and hope it gets better, then what happens is you're never going to learn what it is that's lending itself to that frustration, that unhappiness. But if a man operates under the assumption that, no, I see this thing, if I work hard enough, if I understand a couple of little things, I can figure this out. And you go, no, I'm going to look, I'm going to figure it out. And then you go, oh, that's the reason for that. You add that to your mental database. Then the next time you see something confusing, like, why is she so upset about this? I'm going to be able to understand this one too. And you look and you figure it out. You not only develop the confidence that, wow, my wife can be understood and I can figure out how to make her happy, but you also have the realization that what she does and says makes sense too, just the same way as with men. It is amazing what happens in marriage when we confront those two sets of assumptions. Now, what is it that is going on underneath the surface of men and of women? What are the key things that we tend not to get about each other? Now, again, just like last night, I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface. I'm really going to just get you guys started, and you can see a lot more of the data in the books, in the videos, and that kind of thing, if you're interested in going further. But here is one of the main starting points that we have seen. Much, not all, but much of the heartache, the frustration, the confusion, the things that get in the way of the relationships. Much of that is caused because men and women, it turns out, have two very different sets of insecurities and vulnerabilities. And by the way, and I should explain this before I go any further, all this is based on these big, I think I mentioned last night that I've done 8 of these big nationally representative studies, these big surveys. So this is all, what I'm saying here, this is not my opinion. Usually it contradicted my opinion about, like, for example, how guys were wired. But I do need to say, I am making generalizations. There are always going to be exceptions. I mean, by definition, if 75% of men said one way, by definition, 25% didn't, right? Everybody's an individual, and the key is for people to learn this so that they can get a sense for how this might apply to their husband or their wife. And I'm giving this to you not just as someone who is perhaps a married person in your own relationship, but because you all are the ones who have the ability to get it out more broadly and help the people that you work with. Okay, so it turns out, like I said, men and women in general tend to have 2 different sets of insecurities and vulnerabilities, which means, by definition, something different hurts the other person's feelings than would hurt yours. That's what that means, by definition. So that also means that each person, men and women, tend to have a different set of primary emotional needs, things that light them up, things that make them feel great. And so let me tell you what we found as far as the women's side and the men's side. So women, we as women, tend to have a question underneath the surface that's, am I lovable? I mean, our question underneath the surface, our worry, our vulnerability is, am I lovable? Am I special? Am I beautiful? Am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside? And we love to feel loved, right? We love to feel cherished. We love to feel adored. That's what lights us up. That's kind of, ladies, that's kind of what we think is the whole point of having the relationship to begin with, right? Like, if you're not going to feel loved, what's the point? It's a huge surprise for us as women to find out that for men, that's not the point at all. The men's question was very different. The men's question is more, am I able? Am I adequate? Do I measure up? Am I any good at what I do on the outside? So think about this. Women's, am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside? Men's, am I any good at what I do on the outside? And it lends itself to a totally different set of, again, primary needs. The men on my survey said if they had to make a choice, and by the way, they said they wouldn't want to have to make this choice, but if they had to, each man said, I would give up feeling that my wife or my girlfriend loved me if I could just feel that she appreciated me, that she respected me, that she believed in me, trusted me, and admired me. And those 5 things were far more important to the average man, even than feeling that his wife loved him. That is a huge difference between men and women. So let's talk on the women's side, the understanding men's side for a minute. Like I said, huge difference. And ladies, it gets us as women into so much trouble because we women, we are naturally very good at showing love, right? Even though that's not his primary need. Now, all of us to some degree are insecure about everything, and we all need everything, right? But in terms of the primary stuff, we're really good at saying, honey, I love you, and we'll just, do these things that we hope our man will find to be loving. And at the same time, without realizing it, we might be criticizing him a lot. Or maybe we're questioning his decisions all the time. Or maybe we're, telling him what to do every now and then. Did I hit a nerve? Okay. Actually, it was hilarious. Jeff and I were doing a marriage conference a couple of weeks ago. And I said this thing about sometimes we women might, tell our man what to do. And, of course, it's a marriage conference. So all the husbands and wives are sitting next to each other in the seats. And I looked out and I could see the men were like vibrating in their seats because they were going, I can't nod. I can't nod. I'll get in trouble if I nod, But it's true. We as women, we will just kind of comes out of us. And we don't realize that when we say something like, honey, why did you do that? Or if we tell him, here's the things that you have to do. By the way, I'm going to be gone for the day, so here's the agenda for the kids, and here's all the things you have to do. And by the way, here's what they have to wear, and blah, blah, blah. And we have that thing. We don't realize that what we're saying is, no, you're not able. No, you're not adequate. And by the way, what you did on the outside, it wasn't good enough. And we as women, guys, you have to trust me on this, we have no idea how painful that is. We truly do not realize that that is a man's most painful feeling. As you'll remember last night, we talked about the fact that one of the big aha moments out of all the studies is the finding that in most cases, it's not the big ticket issues that cause most marriage problems. Those happen, and they're tragic, those do, but it's not the majority of cases. Most of the time, you have a good-willed husband and wife who care about each other, and they're trying hard, but because they don't know this stuff, they're trying hard in the wrong areas, or they are hurting each other and never intend to. This is a perfect example of that. And when that happens day after day after day, it can build up this sense of frustration, like this other person doesn't really care about me, when that is absolutely not true. So we have to, if this is all true, we have to learn how to address it. And let's talk, again, talking about the men's side, women understanding men for a minute. We have to know what is it that hits that nerve, that sends that painful message, that hurts the other person's feelings, so that we can avoid that. And we have to know, on the positive side, what do we do as women? What can a wife do to send the positive message? I do appreciate you, I do respect you, I do trust you, believe in you, admire you. What are the things that say that on the positive side? So just really briefly, avoiding hitting the nerve. Anything that sends the signal, I think you are inadequate, is going to hit that nerve. Anything, and it's the little day-to-day stuff that we do that we don't even realize that we're doing. I'll give you an example. So I was flying back home from an event and flying back into Atlanta, and to film the DVD studies that go along with the books. And I was talking next to the guy next to me on the airplane. I should explain, I interview every man I come across. Like, I kind of feel bad for the guy who's trapped next to me on the airplane for 2 hours. But if he's bored and he's reading Sky Magazine, he's fair game. So we got into this conversation, and as we started talking about his relationship with his wife, I could tell he just looked kind of defeated. You know, sometimes you see people and like his shoulders were just slumping. I just felt kind of bad for the guy. And he said a phrase that I had heard in previous years so many times from my husband, Jeff, and I had no idea what Jeff was talking about. And I can guarantee that probably many of the women that you work with, many of their husbands have said this phrase, and the wife had no idea what he was talking about. This guy said, I love my wife, but nothing I do is ever good enough for her. Okay? Now, because of the research, I thought I knew what he was talking about, and I said, can you give me an example? He said, I'll just tell you something that just happened last night. He said, we had friends over for dinner, the kitchen was a wreck, my wife had to run out to a meeting. And she said, honey, would you be willing to clean up the kitchen so that when I come home, we can go right to bed? And he said, yeah, no problem. He said, so I cleaned the kitchen. And she comes home after her meeting and kisses me on the cheek and looks over my shoulder into the kitchen and goes, huh, and grabs a sponge and starts re-cleaning all the countertops. And he said, it just kills me that nothing I do is ever good enough for her. Now, most women, when we hear a story like that, like if I do a women's conference and I tell that story, I will tell you the looks that are on the faces of the women in the room. They're like, are you kidding me? You know, get over it, dude. Like, this is what I used to be thinking. Sort of, that shouldn't bother you. You're so oversensitive, right? And finally, I realized after I'd heard this over and over and over from so many different men, I realized the reason I am saying that should not bother you is that it wouldn't bother me. And that he's not me. He's wired very differently by a God who knew what he was doing. And I asked this gentleman on the plane, is there anything that your wife could have done differently that, you know, you would have received it differently or it would have come across differently or whatever? And he looked at me like I was nuts. I get that look a lot, by the way. And he said, it would have made all the difference if she just would have appreciated what I was trying to do. Like, if I missed the crumbs under the toaster, she can clean it later when I'm not looking. And I realized how often, again, we as women, it's, guys, just so you know, we're not doing this on purpose, but it's in those little day-to-day, minor, unimportant things of life, we're sending that message. What you did on the outside, it wasn't good enough. And we don't intend to send that message, and we have no idea how painful it is, or how dangerous it is to keep sending that day after day after day. So understanding that, helping the women that you work with understand the legitimacy of that, is incredibly high leverage, because it is a little change that will have this really big impact. Another little change is that's avoiding the negative signal that what you did wasn't good enough. The positive signal is even better. You know, what can a woman do to send that message to her husband that she does appreciate him, right? That she does respect him, does believe in him. And this is where I have to tell you, this is embarrassing to admit, but I am such a nerd when it comes to trying to figure this stuff out and apply some of the things I've learned. And, you know, I'm like thinking about my husband, well, you know, I love to hear I love you, right? You know, what can you say to a guy that's going to have that same impact on him that I love you does on me as a woman? And I'm like, you know, well, if my husband's greatest need is to know that I respect him, okay, so I start following Jeff around the house going, oh, honey, I respect you so much. And after a while, my poor husband, he was like, time out. Like, I know what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it, but it doesn't have the same ring to it. Like, that's what Jeff told me. And so I went on this quest to try to figure out, what can you say to a guy that has the same emotional impact on him that I love you does to a woman? And I finally found it in the study of the happiest marriages that we were talking about last night. I finally figured it out in that study. And it's a small little phrase. Does anybody want to guess what I discovered? Some of you probably already know this. You've heard me say it, so don't guess. But can anybody who doesn't know this guess? What can you say to a guy? Good job. That's a good one. I appreciate you. That's good. Keep them coming. I need help. That's good. Okay, I'm really shocked that you haven't mentioned one of them. I was in this big women's conference, and I asked the women to guess. Huge stadium, by the way, like 7,000 women. And one woman yelled out from the top row, "Let's have sex!" You know, like, okay, that probably works too. But that wasn't it. Believe it or not, it's thank you. Believe it or not, thank you. Because think about what this says to a man. Thank you for changing the light bulbs and noticing the light bulbs were burned out in the hallway and putting them in. Thanks for always making me, you know, my juice smoothie in the morning. Thanks for, you know, I know you were so tired and you came home after work and you played with the kids in the yard anyway. You're such a good dad. Thank you. These little day-to-day noticing, it says, think about what it says for a minute. It says, I noticed what you did on the outside, and it was good, and I appreciate it. It says, apparently, all these things that touch a man in these really, really tender places of his heart that a lot of women have no idea that he is longing for that affirmation. And the problem is that we as women, we think those grateful thoughts inside, but it just doesn't come out of our mouths as naturally as I love you comes out. I love you just sort of naturally comes out. We don't realize that we don't say thank you and things like that. All the other things you mentioned are good too. We don't say those things enough. Or, if we do, I hate to say it, but it's like, oh, thanks for mowing the lawn, but you missed a spot, right? And we have no idea that, as the guys said, that's the no thank you, thank you. And that what we have to help women understand, and all of us who work with couples have to, help the female spouse understand, is that for a guy, he's going to be so attuned to how he's doing, he's going to notice that he missed a spot. And that we don't want to get into the habit of essentially saying, what you did on the outside wasn't good enough, you failed. So help the people that you work with, the women, understand how to avoid hitting that negative nerve and how to send that positive message. It makes a huge difference. And by the way, just as a quick note, before I move on to the men's side of things, let me just reiterate, because women don't tend to get this, why this is so important, okay, emotionally to men. We have to help the women understand. It's because the men feel about themselves on the inside very different than how they look on the outside. We women think you guys think you're all that, right? We think you men are so confident in yourself. And instead, we don't realize you have this vulnerability. You have this self-doubt under the surface that we don't know is there. That's what's being hit, that raw nerve, that question, am I good for her as a husband? Am I any good as a husband? Do I know what I'm doing as a dad? I want to be a great salesman, but am I? Those kinds of questions. We women don't realize that vulnerability is there. So that's why it's so crucial for us as women to practice this affirmation. Okay, switching to understanding the women's side of things. Here's one of the most high leverage things. That's one of the most high leverage things on the men's side, understanding men. Here's one on the women's. Guys, you know that your wife needs to feel loved, right? That's not a surprise. What is a surprise usually is you don't realize how easy it is for her to not feel loved. See, when you get married, you as a guy, and you see your wife walk down the aisle, and you say your I do's, and you sign the marriage papers, there's something, I think, in the heart of a man that's sort of like, okay, cool, on to the next thing, And you don't, and it just doesn't come up in your mind whether your wife loves you from that point on. It just doesn't, rise to the surface. It's kind of the reason for that terrible joke, why do I need to tell my wife I love her? I told her when we got married, if anything changes, I'll let her know, And it's horrible, but it's the reason it's funny is it's kind of the way guys sort of feel like, of course I love my wife. What you need to realize as men is remember that underground question, am I lovable? Remember that? That does not go away in marriage. There is no switch in a woman's brain, just because you're married, that gets flipped to the, oh, now I feel permanently loved position. Right? There's no such thing. She has that, am I lovable question. It's just, in marriage, it morphs to, does he still love me? Does he really love me? Is he glad he married me? Would he choose me all over again? And that is underground as a question every day, so she needs to know the answer to that every day. That is one of the most powerful things a man needs to realize. Now, what is it that this sort of feels like and looks like? Again, both on the avoiding the negative and hitting the positive side. So this is sort of the experience of a woman. This is how it sort of feels. Guys, let me give you an example. So suppose that you and your wife have had one of those emotional discussions over breakfast. And there's emotions running high, you're upset with each other, you're like, I gotta get out of the house, I gotta get to work, I have a meeting or whatever. You get in the car, you're upset with each other, you drive away, okay? What happens, guys, in your mind as you leave for work? What happens in your mind to the thought of that meeting? The thought of that emotional conflict with your wife? Gone. Yes. A lot of guys are like, click, It's gone. And Jeff has told me that for him and probably a lot of men, that they're kind of hoping that by the time they get back at night, that it's gone in her mind too. Like, that she's sort of forgotten about it. Ladies, is that true? No. Why is that the case? Here's what's happened. You've had this emotional conflict. She knows you're displeased with you, whatever it is. That underground question, that generic question, am I lovable? And in marriage, does he really love me? That has gone from being this underground latent vulnerability, this underground insecurity. It has now been triggered. It has risen up in her, and it's roiling in her gut. And it's sort of this feeling like, that's the technical term, by the way. That's what it feels like. And it's this, are we okay? That's what it feels like. And that is going to be, are we okay? That is going to be like that. Again, this is not all women. I think this was 82, 87. I have to look it up. Some mid 80% number of women. But that question, are we okay, is going to be circling in her heart until she is reassured. That question is what men tend not to understand. And so there is a power that comes when a guy realizes that he can actually take some action. And there are two things here that we've found to be the most high leverage for men to know. There is something that he can do as a guy to address it, to solve it, to fix it once that insecurity has been triggered by conflict or things just being in a difficult season, whatever that is. You can actually take a step to fix it once it happens, or even better, there's something a man can do to prevent that insecurity, that question from being triggered to begin with. So let's talk about what do you do to fix it once it's happened? So I hate using the words magic bullet, because, if I'm listening to a speaker who says, this is the magic bullet, I'm like, how can you say that? Like, everybody's different, every situation is different. But this is the magic bullet. We tested it on the survey, and I think it was 95% of women said that this either would completely solve it or go a long way towards solving it. When you're in the middle of that conflict and you have to leave for your meeting or whatever it is, or you just have to get space because you just can't think and you need to have time to process, to be able to say, look, I'm angry, I need some space, whatever it is, but I want you to know we're okay. Whew. It makes a huge difference. Now, guys, let me put this in a sort of a term, in terms that you can recognize, and to show you what this feels like. A couple different examples. If I were to ask you as men, how many of you never think and have never thought, don't have in your minds the idea of how you're going to provide for your family? Most men, when we ask that question, no hands are ever raised if we ask it in a marriage conference. Because in the back of a guy's mind, putting this sort of in terms that sort of probably work in your world, in the back of a guy's mind, there's always that question, how am I going to provide for my family? It's always sort of back there somewhere. And the men say, it's something like, look, the economy I have to think about it because, the economy could go down, right? Or our company could lose its biggest client, or I could be 3 or 4 mistakes away from losing my job. In one focus group, a woman stopped the man who was saying that and said, that's exactly how we feel about you and our relationship. We could be 3 or 4 mistakes away from things going downhill. And 3 or 4 arguments away from things going downhill. So when you reassure your wife and you say, look, honey, I'm angry, I need space, but we're okay. What you're doing is telling her this is not the beginning of those 3 or 4 arguments of things going downhill. It's a very simple but surprisingly powerful form of reassurance for a woman. So that's how you fix it once it's happened. That's how you get back on track. How do you prevent, as a guy, and this is even more important, how does a man who loves his wife prevent that insecurity from being triggered? There's one word here that you need to know, and it's the word pursuit. Now, most men, when we say that, they're like, what? And here's the reality, guys, you know, the men you work with already know how to pursue your wife, or how a husband can pursue his wife, because it's that feeling you gave her when you were dating. It's that I'm choosing you all over again today feeling, that wooing her, showing her that you love her today, that she's lovable today, choosing her all over again. Now, when we tell men that, you know how to do this because that's what you did when you were dating, we usually have these guys come up to us afterwards and they say things like, but that was so exhausting, like I got married so I could stop doing that stuff, right? And here's the thing, is men automatically, in their minds, you as men automatically your brains go to the things you did, like arranging the big candlelight dinner, like those big romantic stuff, the picnic in the park or whatever. All that stuff's good, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the signal, the message that I would choose you all over again. You can send your wife the message that I would choose you all over again by reaching across and taking her hand when you're walking through a parking lot. That says, I would choose you all over again. Or by another big one that was huge. We had no idea it would come up so high on the survey. I think it was like 90-something% of the women said a surprisingly big one is when they're sitting together at church or sitting out, in public at dinner with another couple, and he puts his arm around her in church or puts his arm around her. That says, I would choose you all over again. That's powerful. And it's hilarious when I'm doing a pastoral interview and, in front of a congregation, with a pastor talking about some of these things because they're doing a family series or whatever in their sermon series. And I explain that, putting the arm around her, and you see like 10 or 20 men in the congregation go, like, can I do that? It's really funny. And then I tell the women, you are not allowed to go, you are only doing that because she told you to. Believe that this is how he feels. He just didn't know it mattered. So it is powerful when a man learns those little things. It can be anything from the physical things like the hand, the arm around her, putting a hand on her knee, to the things like sending her a text message during the day that says, this has been such a bad day, it's been hard. My boss is all over me. I can't wait to see you later. I love you so much. Send. It took 10 seconds, but she'll save that text message, right? It's these little things that really send that big message. And what happens if you tell the average guy that you're working with, if you try, no matter what, to send that message every day, what you do is you build a sense of certainty under her that he does love me. And therefore, that insecurity that, are we okay? It just doesn't rise up, even when there might be things that trigger it. So because you've built a sense of certainty under her that you do care about her. Okay, so there's one other subject that I feel like I need to cover really briefly, and then I want to allow time for questions. So we have to cover that sex subject, right? Because that's that's something that so gets in the way of so many marriages. And I'll just give you the brief sort of overview of this. But it turns out that both men and women have some pretty important misunderstandings about this in marriage. And there are some couples, by the way, I'm going to be making generalizations again There are some couples who are flipped on this, but in most cases, it's the husband who wants more and the wife maybe who wants less. And so that's usually the mismatch, although it does happen on the other side, but that's a different issue than we can get into here. Although we do address that on our website as well. So here's the misunderstanding on the women's side. We women tend to think of physical intimacy in marriage as being primarily a physical need for him. That's kind of the category we put it in. We say, it's a physical urge, it's a physical need, and you've been chasing little kids around all day, and sleep seems like a physical need too, right? And yet, what we found when I asked the men, what's the importance of this for you? What's the importance of this in your life? What I heard from the men had nothing to do with the physical. Nothing. What I kept hearing from the men was entirely this enormous emotional need that a man can't get met any other way. And here's what the need is. It's the need that every man has to feel that his wife desires him and that she wants him. If a man feels that, if he feels like his wife desires him, it gives him this sense of confidence, we found. It gives a man this sense of well-being. But here's the key that so many women don't understand. It gives him a sense of well-being, not just in the bedroom, but in every other area of his life. And it works in reverse, too. If he doesn't feel desired, if he feels like it's a little too easy for her to say, you know what, honey, I'm really tired, it gives him this sort of feeling like, I must be so undesirable, I can't even compete with her pillow, right? Like, that's not a very good feeling for a guy. And so it gives him this dragging sense of almost like a depression and a lack of well-being in all the other areas of his life. We as women are completely clueless to this incredibly important emotional reality. Most women are. There was one man on the survey, I loved his summary of this. He said, I don't think my wife realizes that what happens the night before in the bedroom, it absolutely impacts how I feel about myself the next day at the office. It's this one-for-one relationship. I saw that and I thought, I bet his wife doesn't realize that, because I know I sure didn't realize that. It makes an enormous difference when we women start seeing that as a really, really special and important emotional need that changes how they feel about themselves in every other area. So that's the misunderstanding. That's the need to understand on the guy's side. So what about on the women's side? Men have a misunderstanding too, it turns out. Men think if it's not happening as much as they would like, that there's only... Men think, well, it's just because I'm not desirable, I'm not desirable for her, certainly, enough for her. And we asked the women on the survey what percentage of the women said that if there was that mismatch on that side, like I said, there's some couples that are flipped, but if she tended to want less, he tended to want more, what were the reasons why? We gave them all these different options. They could choose any or all of them, this big long list. You want to know what percentage of women said it's because he wasn't desirable? 4%. 4% said it's because he wasn't attractive or desirable. 96% said something else. And that 96% are broken up into two main reasons, one far more important than the other. Let me cover the second one first. You've heard this before, you've said this before in your counseling, and it is accurate. It just happens to be not the most important reason, but the second most important reason. And that's that women do need to feel close outside the bedroom in order to want to be close inside the bedroom. That is absolutely accurate. And all the stuff that you've been talking about is important to say. But there is another reason that is far more important than that statistically. And it turns out there is a physiological difference between men and women that makes a huge difference here. This physiological difference, it turns out that there are two different types of desire. There's something called assertive desire. And someone who has assertive desire has a desire to pursue sex and to initiate it and to think about it all the time and be ready at a moment's notice. Guess who tends to have assertive desire, right? It tends to be tied to testosterone and other typically male hormones. Not always, of course, but tends to be more likely to be the man. But there's a whole nother kind of desire. It's called receptive desire. And someone with receptive desire is just as willing, just as interested, enjoys it just as much when it's happening, but doesn't have the same desire to pursue it or initiate it, doesn't think about it all the time, and isn't ready at a moment's notice. Guess who tends to have receptive desire, right? It tends to be tied to estrogen and other typically female hormones. What we tell the men is that someone with receptive desire just has to be approached differently. We tell the guys that she needs to know what you've got on your menu for the evening before you get to the bedroom, basically. And so, men, it's funny, when Jeff and I do a marriage conference and I might say something like that, the men get this alarmed look on their face and they're thinking, you mean I need to warn her? That doesn't feel so good, right? And it's like, no, it's truly what we call it is anticipation time. Just so she's thinking about it ahead of time because she's not ready at a moment's notice. And so literally, I'll give you just a silly example. Okay, there's many ways to do this. Some little flirty comment, some, wink, something. Here's just a silly example. So when Jeff and I were in the middle of writing this chapter, I can't remember what it was that he'd done. It was over breakfast. And Jeff had done something really sweet. And I said, thanks so much for doing that, honey. And he said, just remember that later tonight. And I thought, okay, and can I use that example? Because that's actually a really good example. It's just a little comment, but it gets a woman thinking in a direction she might not have been otherwise. Because see, here's the thing. All of us for years have been mentioning that, being close outside the bedroom before you can be close inside the bedroom. We've been talking about him helping with the chores and scrubbing the toilets and doing things with the kids and taking a load off so, that she can be more relaxed and all of that's good. Obviously, it's really important, but just because he's scrubbing the toilets, is she thinking about sex? He might be. But she's not. So we tell the men, I don't know, when you're scrubbing the toilets, you gotta, do a big wink or something. I don't know. But the key is, for so many couples, is that this is an area of life that is unnecessarily misunderstood. And that it's so crucial emotionally for a marriage. Just to wrap this up, that we have found in our studies, and several other studies like Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia and several others have done studies on this and have found that having even if you have a little bit of a mismatch, having a sense of that you are connecting in this physical intimacy, that this is incredibly important for marriages. And by the way, just as a quick aside for you guys as leaders, because you're working with so many couples on this, we have found in the research, I wrote a couple of articles on this not long ago, we have found in the research that for the person in the relationship, again, it's not always the woman, but it tends to be, who has receptive desire, as long as you have physical intimacy, as long as you have sex once a week, it raises the testosterone level, because everybody has testosterone. It's not just a male hormone. Women have some testosterone too, and that's what leads to that libido, right? As long as you have sex once a week, it stimulates the testosterone level enough that it becomes self-sustaining. But if it drops below once a week, your testosterone levels start to drop. And you desire it less, so you have it less, and then your testosterone levels drop even more, so you desire it less, and it becomes a really, it can become a real negative cycle, as I'm sure many of you have seen in the couples that you've worked with. But as long as about once a week the testosterone levels are stimulated enough to have that sense of desire there. And that's one simple thing that can sometimes make a big difference. And especially, it makes a difference once women realize that this truly is a huge emotional need for most men, not just a physical one. Because then it's an emotional need, not a demand, right? It's something that changes how he feels about himself. So I'm out of time, basically. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions and answers. But I just want to encourage you guys to encourage your people with the fact that sometimes they can try a couple of these little changes and see some big differences. And if they will try a few of these little things, like he's taking her hand when they're walking across a parking lot, or looking for opportunities to say I love you and show those I would choose you all over again. And if she's looking for opportunities to say things like thank you and affirm him out loud in ways she might not have done before, they will start to see immediate positive changes, and then that can be a huge incentive to keep going. And I want to, by the way, can I just tell you guys thank you for the work that you do with couples, those of you who in the room who do that, because I don't. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a therapist. My job is to equip you, and I really want to thank you for the work you do, because you're really out there doing the stuff. So thank you, guys. I know we have a few minutes for questions, and I'd love to hear what questions you guys have, because I know there's a lot of them. Oops.
Yeah. Thank you again for all the wonderful insights this morning. How do we help men? We're seeing higher increase on women infidelity in marriage.
Women what?
Infidelity in marriage used to be, and women used to be more resilient when it happened to them. But it seems more difficult to help men to get out of the depression when it happened to them. So what do you find in the studies maybe that, based on the different needs that can be done, so men are able to rebound back and say, we can work, I can work this, I can trust this woman again, I can just...
Because let me tell you, if you're talking about infidelity where it's the woman who's cheating on him, and that's obviously the biggest form of saying you're inadequate as a husband, right? I mean, any infidelity is triggering the most painful feeling on both sides. For what we have found in some cases, and I haven't studied this in a systemic way, so I only have kind of the different stories that we've heard, the different people that we've interviewed, is that with many men actually, and this is going to sound kind of funny, I'm going to say it anyway, men actually can be more forgiving than women can about even big problems in the marriage, if they see that there is true repentance, if they see that she is truly making an effort to have that sense of affirmation or whatever it was that went wrong. But there is no easy fix, obviously, to that in either case. And I think, honestly, it really is about, I think you had somebody talking about forgiveness here. I mean, really, that's what it comes down to. It becomes not a man-woman thing. It becomes a forgiveness thing, right? And that then gets into all those issues of, is the other person truly repentant? Are they signaling those things? And is the person willing to forgive? I don't know that that's necessarily gender-related. Does that make sense? Are you guys seeing more with women cheating on their husbands than the other way around now? I wouldn't have thought so, but I know it's happening more than it used to. Have any of you worked recently with women who have cheated on their husbands? Anybody? Anybody have anything that you want to recommend to him? His question was, if you have a woman who's cheated on her husband, that's happening more in his experience. He's seen a little bit more of that, and wondering how to help men walk through that, because it is going to be a little bit different. No. This is actually a good example of something that I'm curious if somebody has some specific knowledge that they want to share. Is it on? I saw him turn it on. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. If anybody has any insight that they think might be gender related on this, I'd love to hear it. Just maybe afterwards let me know too, because I don't know if there is a gender difference in how men forgive and work through it with if their wife is the one, or vice versa, but I'd be interested to see if anybody has any of that information.
You shared that these small things can make a big difference in relationships. Is that the same counsel, or would that be the same that you've seen in your research for couples that have gone stonewall with each other, refusing to talk, about to go into a divorce? Do the little things matter? Would you counsel them to try those little things, or would you try to say you got to go with the bigger things?
Yeah, so okay. The question about will the little things matter when you've got a couple that's so raw and are so close to a divorce? The answer is yes, sometimes, and it depends on what's been going on. Because if it is a big thing like infidelity, the little things can help bring a little bit of trust back, but they're not necessarily going to solve it. But if it's truly just that the couple has just really gotten sideways and they just aren't communicating and they're really unhappy and they're fighting all the time and they've gotten to this idea that it's never going to get better, which is a pretty big chunk of people, then we found sometimes the little things can make a huge difference. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've gotten emails, I've had people come up to me at book tables, we've gotten phone calls where people have said, literally, I was supposed to meet with a divorce lawyer on Wednesday. And, I read the book and I'm canceling the meeting. And I'm like, I'm sorry, if a 200-page book can save a marriage, there's a lot of unnecessary divorces going on. you know? And it just shows how easily people can get hopeless. And that sometimes, literally, like I had one woman who all she did, they were so close to that, and all she did was stop herself from saying negative things to her husband and start saying thank you, like noticing the positive and affirming him and saying these things. That's it. That's all she did that changed. And it completely transformed their marriage. It didn't solve everything, but it set them on like a good path instead of a bad path. So there certainly won't, it's not going to solve the big issues, but when you've just got a couple that's gotten completely hopeless, it can make a big difference. Yeah.
Earlier, you had mentioned the 5 things when a man. I mean, I think you mentioned 5 things. One of them is like appreciation, respect, and believe.
Believe in him, trust him, and admire him.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, just for any of you who work with singles, the most appealing, most attractive feeling that single men said that they found the most attractive in his woman is if they feel like she admires him. So, just as a quick aside.
Okay, so if I would say that if a woman don't do like maybe at least like if she do like maybe 2 out of 5 things and have her like respect, it may not work out right.
Yeah, no, listen, and it's a process too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier for me, and I'll just be really transparent. It's easier for me to show appreciation for my husband than to show that I trust him. Like when he's making a decision that I'm like, I totally don't agree with that. La la la. You know, I'm not gonna second guess what he's doing. It's much easier. I've gotten into the habit of saying thank you and appreciating him, but that stopping myself from telling him what to do and second guessing him, that's harder for me. I'm still working on that. So it's not like all of that is sort of wrapped up under the, you know, biblically God says, you know, Ephesians 5:33, you know, husbands love your wives, wives see to it that you respect your husbands. That's all kind of wrapped up under the idea of respect. But there's many different ways, those 5 things are the different ways it plays out. And we're not going to be perfect on all of them all at once.
Okay.
Sure thing. Sure. Thank you, guys.
For those of you who may have come in after we began, I would like to just let you know that Shanti's books are going to be for sale until about 10 o'clock when we start getting into our workshops. So if you want to get something from her table, now's a good time to do that. Also, I'd like to remind you that there is, for Spanish speakers, there is a workshop exclusively for you. And so look at the program for that. That's up in N310. And also, after our morning workshops at 12:30, there is lunch for all of us. That's a part of your registration. And it's across the street in the Howard Performing Arts Center lobby. So we'll see you then. Enjoy your workshops. Take a nice break.